Aroa is a group of islands in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean. 80 million years ago, the chain of islands broke away from the landmass that would eventually become New Zealand and Australia. It's made up of a series of individual biomes, including marine estuaries and wetlands, forests, snow-capped mountains, and active volcanoes. As ghosts, we spend the majority of our time blowing it to pieces in the fight to gain control of Skeltec headquarters. However, through the game we come across a number of relics dating as far back as 21,000 BC, and these give us numerous insights into Aroa's rich past. The Ring of Fire refers to a chain of volcanoes shaped like a horseshoe, found in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and are the result of the plate tectonics, where the massive Pacific plate interacts with the less dense plates around it. With 75% of the Earth's volcanoes located along this chain, and 90% of the Earth's earthquakes occurring along its path, here at the edge of this Ring of Fire lies Aroa. Islands like Golem and Darkwood Island have volcanic origins. They are the result of volcanoes that have surfaced from the ocean floor thousands of years ago. Darkwood Island, for example, is the last remnant of a monumental explosion that occurred in 21,300 BC and is thought to be of one of the largest known volcanic explosions of all time. During the eruption, ash and rock was thrown into the atmosphere before the volcano collapsed in on itself, creating Lake Catherine. The earliest traces of human presence on Aroa date back to 500 BC. Unlike the other people of the South Pacific, these first inhabitants came from the east, from Central or South America, and not from Polynesia. These people had navigational talents, agriculture, hunting and fishing, and technology based on wood and stone. After centuries on the islands, the civilization seems to have just up and vanished, sometime during the 16th century. Early evidence shows that this could have been because of volcanic eruption. In 1845, survivors of the disappearance were found living deep in the thick forests of Darkwood Island. Only a few families remained, totaling a number of around 100. With a language that differed from those of Polynesia, they claimed that their ancestors had come from the east, from an endless land, and that their people had abandoned the area because of the anger of the earth. In a few generations, these survivors were integrated into the population of Aroa. Their language was lost, as well as most of their customs. Only a few families kept bits of the old traditions, such as the ancestral names of their people, the Kings of the Forest. This term can be seen all over the islands, represented in the drawings of large felines. The Kings of the Forest civilization lived for 2,000 years on Aroa. Many ruins still remain: villages, harbours, forts, cemeteries and sanctuaries. Today they're commonly referred to as the Ancients. 1773. Captain Cook was on his second voyage when he discovered Aroa. He found an empty, uninhabited land, but noted that it was covered in ruins and remains of a civilization that once lived there. The Polynesians accompanying Cook knew these islands. They called it Aroa, a land that was cursed in their eyes. According to them, the people who lived there came a long time ago from the rising sun. During the exploration, Captain Cook discovered the ruins of an abandoned Spanish fortress. The fort seemed to have been stormed and its garrison massacred. So Westerners had, in the past, already set foot on this land, but the discovery was never published, perhaps on purpose. Captain Cook's discovery of Aroa was followed by the arrival of many adventurers in search of a quick fortune. Europe's increasing demand for seal skins brought a large number of hunters to Aroa, where at the time seal colonies were plentiful. Traces of seal hunting can still be found in the Seal Islands and the Channels areas. The Southern Ocean is full of plankton and krill, meaning that the cold waters south of Aroa sheltered a large population of whales. At the beginning of the 19th century, whaling ships prowled around Aroa and became Aroa's main source of revenue. Ports and factories were built along the western coast, allowing the hunting season to be extended. Extensive hunting eventually led to the disappearance of whales from this region, and with them, the whalers left Aroa near the end of the century. abandoned ports and factories may still be visited on the Wild Coast, Whalers Bay, and the Windy Island regions. In the 19th century, few Europeans were willing to make the long, uncertain journey to live in the islands of Aroa. In 1837, investors created the Aroa Company to boost the population. The private company covered the travel costs for anyone who wished to settle on these distant islands. Settlers came in large numbers, many of them Scottish, and chose the most fertile regions of Aroa to farm or breed sheep. In 1860, a farmer discovered gold nuggets while ploughing his fields. The news spread quickly throughout Aroa. The gold rush had begun. Settlers abandoned their plots of land to pursue a career as prospectors. From neighbouring New Zealand, Australia, California and Europe, thousands of people came to seek their fortune in Aroa. By 1921, the gold deposits had dried up, and the prospectors either returned home or to their farms. December 1941. Japan had just attacked the American base of Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Ocean became the new battlefield of the Second World War. As early as 1942, Japanese forces advanced through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, threatening Australia. The United Kingdom, struggling in Europe, was unable to help. It was the United States that took responsibility for stopping the Japanese advance towards the South Pacific. The US forces built many land, sea and air bases to support their efforts, and Aroa was chosen to host several of these. These bases were built in the Fen Bog, Channels and Sea Islands provinces. Their main role was to support the logistical efforts of the Navy and aviation forces. No fighting took place on Aroa, except for a few air raids against airfields. In 1945, the military population was around 21,000 and exceeded the civilian population of 16,000. Once the war was over, the number of sailors at these bases was reduced to just a few hundred. By 1948, it was clear that the USA and the USSR, once fighting a common enemy in World War II, had now become bitter rivals. Their fight for global dominance would continue for decades. During this period, the Pacific Ocean became an essential front of the Cold War. The USSR built a new war fleet aimed at competing with the US for control of the seas. As the USSR increased its nuclear capabilities, US military bases were established outside of the reach of the Russian bombers. Already having the infrastructure inherited from the Second World War, Aroa was chosen to house one of these new major bases, aimed at blocking Russian expansion in the Pacific. Since the end of the Second World War, Aroa's population had fallen to less than 10,000. With the gold mines abandoned and the whales and seals exterminated, agriculture was the only thing that remained. But the Pentagon had plans for this area. In order to combat espionage, it was preferable to settle on islands without civilians. In 1949, talks with the British government began, and by 1953, the British Crown sold to the US a renewable 99-year lease for the exclusive use of Aroa for military purposes. Following the British government's lease of Aroa, the Pentagon ordered the eviction of the civilian population. This was accompanied by a substantial compensation, purchase of land, and payment of relocation costs to either England or the United States. Most of the remaining 9,000 inhabitants on Aroa accepted these conditions, abandoning their native islands. By the end of 1954, the last inhabitants, hiding in the jungle of the Darkwood Island, were captured and expelled. Over the next 5 years, the older World War II bases were transformed into state-of-the-art facilities. Most of the villages were torn down to make way for new settlements, but there are few remnants of the old towns that can still be found. Since 1965, the Aroa Islands have become a giant US military base. A 1953 agreement with the United Kingdom forbid the use or storage of nuclear weapons on Aroa, but they were secretly being kept in underground shelters. The Pentagon relied on the absence of any civilian or military surveillance to keep the weapons a secret. However, spies managed to infiltrate the base and information was made public. A crisis broke out between the US and the United Kingdom. The Aroa nuclear bomb crisis ended in 1984 after the Pentagon removed the bombs and promised not to store them there in the future. The departure of the nuclear weapons was filmed and broadcast, but some continued to claim that not all of them had left Aroa. With the Berlin Wall's collapse in 1989 and the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, the Cold War effectively ended. In the absence of an enemy, the American government asked the Pentagon to reduce its budget accordingly. One of the measures taken was the closure of several bases, particularly those built outside of the US. So in 1996, the Aroa base was demilitarized and closed, with the site's equipment dismantled and shipped to the US. By the end of 1996, the Aroa Islands were once again deserted. But not for long. Several former soldiers decided to settle there illegally. They would later be known as the Homesteaders. Though the Pentagon still held a lease for the area, no one cared about these lost islands in the South Pacific anymore, so they were put up for auction. And in 2008, J. Skell purchased Aroa to become the hub for the technological advancement of mankind. And from here we pretty much know how the story goes. In 2009, construction of the new Skell Technology headquarters begins on the island, and in 2020, drone production begins. There is a couple more relics that we haven't managed to acquire, so there may be a date or two missing, or maybe these are something meant to be discovered later on. But before I go any further, I must thank a mate of mine for helping me out with a lot of the information I've discussed here. I certainly haven't had the time that I wished I could have had to find all of the stuff in the game by now, but thanks to Cabes and his newly found addiction to Ghost Recon Breakpoint, he was able to provide me with a lot of the collectibles and intel. If you guys can do me a huge favour, he has just started streaming his new addiction on Twitch. He's been going for maybe a week or two now, including a 26-hour stream, the crazy bastard. As a sign of thanks for me, please pop over to his channel and say hi. Maybe even chuck him a follow, I'd really appreciate it. I'll have a link in the description. He really has done me a solid here, and probably with the next couple of videos too, so check him out. You may even catch me partaking in his stream from time to time. I'll warn you though, he's a Kiwi too, so you'll have to deal with some more of that awkward Kiwi accent. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!